The video begins with an open shot of a calm, serene park on a bright, sunny day. Birds chirp in the background, and the soft rustling of trees adds a peaceful ambience. The camera zooms in on a man, sitting casually on a bench under a large tree. This is Dwayne, "The Rock" Johnson, playing the role of a regular parkgoer, seemingly enjoying a quiet moment of relaxation. He's dressed in simple, comfortable clothes, blending in perfectly with the peaceful setting of the park. He looks around, taking in the scenery, giving off a vibe of contentment. Yet his relaxed demeanor contrasts sharply with what is about to unfold. The tranquility of the park, however, is about to be interrupted by the arrival of Officer Kane, a police officer patrolling the area. Officer Kane, played by a different actor, is seen striding across the park with a purposeful step, clearly on duty. His uniform is crisp, and his attitude is confident. Yet there's an underlying arrogance in his walk. He spots The Rock sitting on the bench, and his eyes narrow. It's not clear at first why he's focused on this one individual in the park, but his gaze is fixed and judgmental. As Officer Kane approaches, he begins to size up The Rock in a manner that feels oddly confrontational. The camera cuts to a close-up of Kane's face, showing a hint of suspicion or perhaps disdain. With a forced air of authority, he stops in front of the bench and looks down at The Rock, who remains sitting, his posture relaxed and unbothered by the officer's presence. It's clear that this is a moment of tension, but neither man speaks immediately. The peacefulness of the park seems to stand in stark contrast to the building unease between them. Officer Kane speaks first, his voice loud and demanding, asking The Rock if he's allowed to be there. His tone is dismissive and condescending. The Rock looks up, his expression unreadable at first. He responds with a calm, confident voice, saying he's just enjoying the park, like anyone else would. This simple statement, however, seems to further irritate Kane, who begins to make derogatory remarks. Officer Kane's behavior starts to reflect more than just a simple inquiry. It feels like an unwarranted challenge, as if he's testing The Rock for something he perceives as a slight, though The Rock has done nothing to provoke it. As the officer continues to question The Rock's presence, his attitude becomes more hostile. He orders The Rock to leave, accusing him of being a troublemaker. Despite the lack of any actual wrongdoing, The Rock, still sitting calmly, remains composed, refusing to let the officer's words rile him up. Instead of reacting with anger or aggression, The Rock maintains his poise, setting the stage for the conflict to escalate further. This interaction serves as the catalyst for what's to come, as it highlights the contrast between The Rock's calm demeanor and Kane's increasing hostility. This initial confrontation lays the groundwork for a deeper narrative about power, respect, and the consequences of unjust actions. The peaceful setting of the park, now overshadowed by Kane's antagonism, sets the stage for a powerful exchange between these two individuals, where more than just words will be tested. As Officer Kane approaches The Rock, the tension in the air becomes palpable. The serene park setting, with its birds chirping and sunlight filtering through the trees, seems to contrast sharply with the animosity that is beginning to unfold between the two men. The officer's movements are deliberate and quick, his eyes scanning The Rock from head to toe. His gaze is cold, judgmental, and calculating, as if he's looking for something wrong, something to justify his growing suspicion. The Rock, on the other hand, remains seated on the park bench, his posture relaxed and his expression neutral. He doesn't seem at all bothered by the approaching officer, his focus on the natural beauty around him as if he's completely oblivious to the impending confrontation. As Officer Kane reaches the bench, he stands in front of The Rock, crossing his arms over his chest, a clear sign of authority and control. The Rock doesn't immediately acknowledge him, continuing to gaze at the trees in front of him, the slight smile on his face not giving any hint of alarm. For a brief moment, the tension hangs in the air, almost as if both men are waiting for the other to make the first move. The officer breaks the silence with a question that's more of a demand than a polite inquiry. "Excuse me, sir." Officer Kane begins, his tone firm and cold. "What are you doing here?" The Rock finally looks up, meeting the officer's eyes with a calm but unwavering gaze. He doesn't flinch under the officer's scrutiny, his face unruffled. Just sitting here, enjoying the day. He responds with a simple, laid-back tone that doesn't convey any sign of trouble. The Rock's demeanor is open, even friendly, as if there's no reason for this interaction to escalate. However, Officer Kane doesn't seem to share the same sentiment. The officer's eyes narrow slightly, his lips pressing into a thin line as he evaluates the situation. Enjoying the day. Huh, he repeats, the words dripping with skepticism. You sure you're allowed to be here? I don't think I've seen you around before. The Rock remains unfazed, his response still calm. I come here often. It's a public park, right? Everyone's allowed. At this, Officer Kane's posture stiffens. His arms unfold and his hands rest on his hips, as if he's now the one in control of the situation. Public park or not, he says, you're not exactly blending in with the crowd. Maybe you should leave before things get complicated. The Rock looks at him with a raised eyebrow, clearly taken aback by the officer's sudden aggression. His expression softens into one of mild confusion rather than anger. Complicated, he asks, his tone still casual, almost as if he's expecting this to be some kind of misunderstanding. Look, I'm not doing anything wrong, just here to enjoy a peaceful moment. I'll leave if that's what you want. But there's really no reason for this to be complicated. But Kane is not convinced. He steps closer, invading the Rock's personal space, as if trying to intimidate him. No reason for this to be complicated. Huh, he says with a forced chuckle. Let me tell you something, buddy. People like you don't just sit in parks and enjoy the peace. There's always something more going on. I've been doing this job long enough to know when something's not right. The Rock's calm demeanor remains unshaken, but there's a flicker of disbelief in his eyes as he realizes the officer isn't simply making an inquiry. He's making assumptions. The Rock sits up straighter on the bench, his hands resting calmly on his lap. People like me, he repeats, his voice steady but now tinged with curiosity. What exactly does that mean? You know me? Officer Kane's face hardens, and his gaze shifts from the Rock's face to the park around them, as if searching for some kind of validation for his suspicions. I know enough, he mutters. You don't belong here. You're not the type to just relax and enjoy the day. And if you're not causing trouble, why don't you just leave? It's that simple. The Rock shakes his head, a slight chuckle escaping his lips. So, that's it? Because I don't look like someone who belongs here. I'm the problem. His voice carries a note of disbelief, as though the absurdity of the situation is finally sinking in. I'm just a guy sitting on a bench in a park, minding my own business. What else do you need to see to let me be? Officer Kane doesn't seem to be listening to reason. He's so fixated on whatever preconceived notion he has about the Rock that he fails to see the truth in front of him. You're being difficult, Kane says, his voice rising slightly. Just get up and leave, and we won't have any problems. Keep pressing, and you'll regret it. This is the turning point in the conversation. The Rock, who has been nothing but calm and patient, now stands up slowly, his height giving him an imposing presence over the officer. His eyes meet Kane's with a steady gaze, his posture relaxed but unyielding. You're making a mistake, The Rock says, his voice low but firm. I'm not the one causing trouble here, but if you want to make a scene, I'll leave. But you should know, I'm not afraid of your threats. The officer takes a step back, momentarily taken aback by The Rock's stature and presence. For a split second, it seems like Kane might reconsider, but his pride and authority won't let him back down. You'll regret this, he warns. You've been warned. The Rock raises his hands in mock surrender, a smirk playing at the corner of his mouth. No, officer. I think it's you who will regret this. With that, The Rock walks away, leaving Officer Kane standing in the park, fuming with frustration. The encounter has been a collision of egos, with The Rock showing calm assertiveness in the face of unjust authority and Kane wielding his power with arrogance, unaware that his actions have been misplaced. As The Rock strides away, the peacefulness of the park slowly returns, but a lingering tension remains. What began as a simple moment of relaxation has now turned into a test of power, respect, and authority, a situation that will have consequences for both men. As The Rock walks away from the bench, he feels the weight of the officer's gaze lingering on his back. The tension between them remains thick, though the physical distance between them increases. He tries to shake off the uneasy feeling gnawing at him, focusing instead on the familiar rhythm of his footsteps on the gravel path. The day, despite the interaction with Officer Kane, is still beautiful, the sun shining down through the trees, casting long shadows across the ground. Yet, something feels off. He senses the officer's resentment, simmering just beneath the surface, and he knows deep down that this is not over. The park, usually a sanctuary of tranquility, now feels charged with hostility. The occasional chirping of birds seems distant, as if even the natural world senses the building storm. As The Rock walks farther away from the bench, a sudden sound slices through the calm air, the heavy thud of boots hitting the ground, followed by rapid footsteps. It's Officer Kane, and he's not done yet. In an instant, The Rock feels the officer's presence right behind him, too close for comfort. Without warning, a hand grabs the shoulder of his jacket, yanking him to a stop. The force of the grab is unexpected, and it stirs a mix of confusion and anger in The Rock's chest. He spins around, meeting the officer's furious eyes, his body tensing as adrenaline spikes. "What the hell is this?" The Rock demands, his voice low but steady, his eyes narrowing as he meets Officer Kane's glare. He's never been one to back down from confrontation, but this moment feels different. Kane's breath is heavy, his face twisted in a mix of rage and something darker, something personal. "I warned you," Kane growls through clenched teeth, his grip tightening on The Rock's jacket. "You think you can just walk away without consequences? You don't get to disrespect me. Not here. Not now." The Rock, still calm despite the rising heat in the officer's voice, shrugs off the officer's hand. His eyes never leave Kane's, his posture relaxed but ready for whatever comes next. "I'm not disrespecting you. I'm walking away like you told me to," he replies, his voice still cool and composed, though the undertones of disbelief are impossible to hide. "But you're not listening. You're the one escalating this, not me." Kane's eyes flash with a fury that makes The Rock's stomach tighten. Without warning, the officer takes a step forward, his arm raised in a quick, sharp motion. The Rock barely has time to react as Kane swings at him with a force that sends a shock through the air. The punch lands squarely on The Rock's jaw, the impact hard and sudden. The world seems to slow as The Rock's head snaps to the side, the sting of the blow vibrating through his skull. For a split second, his vision blurs, and his body instinctively flinches. It's the first real hit he's taken in years, and the force of it is jarring. His breath catches in his chest, and for a brief moment, the air around him feels thick and heavy. But the shock of the blow is quickly replaced with something deeper, something primal. It's anger, but it's also the recognition that this confrontation has crossed a line. This is no longer just about words or power struggles. This is an attack, and it's one that The Rock will not take lightly. He steadies himself, his hand instinctively rising to his jaw as he regains his balance. The anger that surges through him is immediate and fierce, but he doesn't let it consume him. He knows that reacting recklessly would only play into Kane's hands. Instead, he focuses on the officer's movements, his body poised for the next move. Officer Kane, emboldened by the punch he just landed, sneers at The Rock. He takes another step forward, this time swinging with a wide, wild motion, clearly intent on continuing the assault. The Rock's instincts kick in, and he sidesteps quickly, dodging the punch with ease. He's faster than Kane, and the officer's momentum carries him forward, leaving him unbalanced for a split second. The Rock seizes the opportunity. With one swift motion, The Rock grabs the officer's wrist, twisting it with precision to disarm him. The officer's face contorts in pain as The Rock wrenches his arm, forcing him to stumble backward. The Rock's eyes flash with intensity as he holds the officer's arm in place, his grip firm and controlled. "This is a mistake, officer," The Rock says, his voice low and controlled, every word dripping with authority. "You don't want to escalate this further." But Officer Kane, his face flushed with rage, isn't listening. He grits his teeth and spits on the ground, his eyes burning with fury. With a burst of strength, he tries to break free from the rock's grip, but the rock holds him steady. The officer, desperate to regain control of the situation, attempts to land another punch. But this time, the rock is ready. He ducks under Kane's wild swing and delivers a quick jab to the officer's abdomen, forcing him to take a step back. The blow knocks the wind out of Officer Kane, and for a moment, he staggers backward, gasping for air. The rock, his chest rising and falling steadily, takes a step back, giving the officer some space. He doesn't want to fight. He doesn't want this to go any further. But Officer Kane, his pride bruised and his judgment clouded by rage, charges at him again, no longer thinking clearly. The rock, calm as ever, braces himself for the impact, his eyes focused on the officer's every movement. Kane's reckless charge comes too quickly, and the rock sidesteps once more. Using the officer's momentum against him, Kane stumbles forward, and with a quick movement, the rock uses his body to send the officer crashing to the ground, his back hitting the hard gravel with a thud. For a moment, everything is silent. The officer lies on the ground, gasping for breath, his hands clutching his chest as if the wind has been knocked out of him. The rock stands over him, his expression unreadable. There's no satisfaction in the way he looks down at the officer. No triumph, just a sense of inevitability. This confrontation, for all its build-up, has ended in the only way it could, with one of them yielding, and the other walking away. "You brought this on yourself," the rock says quietly, his voice not cruel, but firm. "I didn't want this, but you attacked me." With that, he turns and begins to walk away, his pace steady and unhurried. Officer Kane remains on the ground, struggling to catch his breath, his pride shattered, his authority no longer unquestioned. The park, once again, seems to settle into silence, but the echoes of the confrontation still linger in the air, a reminder of what happens when power and arrogance collide. The rock's breath comes in steady, controlled bursts as he stands tall, his muscles tense but his mind clear. The world seems to freeze for a moment after the violent clash with Officer Kane. The officer's body, now lying on the gravel path, is a stark contrast to the calm composure the rock holds in the aftermath. His fists, once raised in defense, are now relaxed at his sides, and he can feel the heat of the encounter still coursing through him. The adrenaline that surged when Kane first swung at him begins to subside, leaving behind the cold realization of the reality he's just faced. He can't help but let his mind drift for a moment. This wasn't just a physical altercation, it was a moment that would have consequences. The tension, the animosity, all of it had been building under the surface for a long time. And now, here it was, unleashed in the form of an attack from a law enforcement officer. The absurdity of it, the breach of authority, isn't lost on him. He had been minding his own business, trying to simply exist in the space he had claimed for himself. Yet, in an instant, all of that was shattered by the unprovoked assault of a man who wore a badge. A man who should have been the one to protect peace rather than sow discord. The rock stands still, his back turned to Kane's sprawled form, allowing the sounds of the park to fill his senses once more. Birds chirp in the distance, and a light breeze rustles through the leaves of nearby trees. The world continuing on as if nothing out of the ordinary had happened. But the rock knows better. The silence of the surroundings isn't what it seems. It's the kind of silence that follows an explosion, the kind that hangs in the air like smoke, lingering and suffocating. As his mind races through the implications of the attack, he feels a deep, simmering anger begin to take hold. This isn't just about a physical altercation. It's about something deeper, something much more significant. The officer's attack on him is a manifestation of a larger issue, one that has been festering in the shadows for far too long. It's the kind of aggression that the rock has seen before, but never in such a personal way. It's the kind of power dynamic where the person who is supposed to uphold the law uses it as a weapon to dominate and belittle. He understands that the officer likely sees himself as untouchable, as someone above reproach because of his badge, his position. But the rock knows that power, when abused, can be toppled, and it's up to him to ensure that the officer understands the consequences of his actions. His fists clench for a moment, the tightness of his grip pulling him back into focus. He's no stranger to physical confrontation. In fact, it's something he's been through countless times in his life. But this is different. This is about making a stand, showing the officer, and anyone who might be watching, that such behavior won't be tolerated. He knows that the consequences of this encounter won't just end with Kane on the ground. The situation has escalated to a point where it can no longer be brushed under the rug. The Rock feels the weight of the moment pressing on him, and though his instincts tell him to walk away, to avoid further conflict, there's a deeper part of him that knows this is a turning point. He can't simply walk away, not when there's so much at stake. The officer, still struggling to regain his breath, shifts on the ground. His face is red with rage and humiliation, but it's also tinged with something else, a flicker of fear. Something The Rock knows all too well. Fear is a powerful motivator, and it's something Kane is now learning firsthand. The Rock can sense it. Even if it's only faint, the officer is no longer the one in control. The Rock is. The officer groans as he pushes himself up to his knees, glaring at The Rock with an intensity that almost borders on desperation. There's no apology, no sign of remorse, just an unwavering sense of defiance. His hand presses against the gravel as he struggles to steady himself. The scrape of his palms against the rough surface a sharp contrast to the smoothness of The Rock's calculated movements. The officer's words come out in a low growl, a mix of anger and pride. "You're going to regret this." Officer Kane spits, his voice hoarse but full of venom. "You think you can just do whatever you want? That you're above the law? I'll make sure you pay for this." The Rock's response is calm, unwavering. He turns his head slightly, keeping his eyes locked on the officer's. His posture relaxed but radiating an unspoken strength. He could feel the heat of Kane's words, but he doesn't let them get under his skin. He's dealt with threats before, and this one is no different. "No, Kane," The Rock says, his voice cutting through the officer's anger like a blade. "You're the one who's going to regret this. You attacked me, and that's something you'll have to answer for. This isn't about me being above the law. It's about you thinking you could use it to hurt someone without facing any consequences." Kane stares at him, his breath heavy, his face contorted with the realization that the tables have turned. There's no denying the weight of The Rock's words, and it's clear that the officer is now grappling with the full extent of what he's done. The pride that had once fueled his actions is now being replaced with the bitter taste of regret. He stands up shakily, wiping the dirt from his uniform, his eyes still locked on The Rock. But there's a flicker of hesitation now, something he didn't show before. The Rock steps forward, his gaze unyielding. "I'm not looking for a fight, but I won't let you get away with this. You don't get to lay your hands on me, or anyone else, just because you wear a badge. You've crossed a line, and you'll face the consequences for it." There's no malice in his voice, no desire for revenge, just a firm resolve to make sure that what happened today isn't swept under the rug. He can already hear the sirens in the distance, the sound of law enforcement coming closer. The officer has made his move, and now it's time for him to answer for it. With one final, steady glance at Officer Kane, The Rock turns on his heel, his purpose clear. He's done here. The officer's future is no longer in his hands. What happens next is out of his control. But The Rock knows that he's done everything he can to right the wrong that was done to him. As he walks away, the adrenaline still pulses through him, but the decision is made. He's not looking back. The officer will face the consequences of his actions, and The Rock will make sure of it. He knows that this won't be the last time he faces someone like Officer Kane, but he also knows that as long as he stands firm, as long as he holds onto his integrity, he'll always be able to face whatever comes next with the same unshakable resolve. As Officer Kane sits in his squad car, his hands shaking slightly as they grip the steering wheel, a deep sense of confusion and regret begins to settle in. His mind races through the events that transpired just moments ago, replaying every second of his confrontation with The Rock. The sound of the punch landing, the shock of seeing his own powerlessness in the face of someone who stood so much taller than him, not just physically, but in the way he carried himself. It had been a rash, impulsive decision, one driven more by his own frustrations than any real sense of duty or justice. But in the heat of the moment, Kane hadn't been able to see that. He had acted without thinking, and now, As he sits in the quiet of his car, the magnitude of what he's done begins to set in. The initial anger, the adrenaline, had made him feel invincible. When he approached the rock, expecting some form of confrontation, he had anticipated a quick exchange of words and maybe a struggle, nothing more. What he hadn't expected was to be caught off guard by the rock's calm, measured response. Or worse, the way his own strength had crumbled under the sheer will of a man who refused to back down. Officer Kane had let his own insecurities get the better of him, thinking that the badge and authority granted him a power that was unassailable. But in the face of someone like the Rock, it was clear that power was fleeting. The words the Rock had spoken to him still echo in Kane's mind, ringing with a clarity he couldn't ignore. You don't get to lay your hands on me, or anyone else, just because you wear a badge. They weren't just words of anger or defiance. They were a reminder, a challenge to the very core of Kane's beliefs. His job was to protect, to serve. And yet in that moment, he had become the very thing he swore to fight against, an abuser of authority, someone who used their position to instill fear rather than security. Officer Kane shifts uneasily in his seat. His mind drifts back to his training, the lessons drilled into him about justice, restraint, and the importance of maintaining control in any situation. He had been taught that his authority was a tool to be wielded with responsibility and thoughtfulness. But in his anger, that lesson had been forgotten. He had let a fleeting moment of frustration dictate his actions. And now the consequences were clear. The face of the Rock comes to his mind once more, calm, steady, and unwavering, even in the midst of an attack. The officer can't help but wonder what kind of man the Rock truly was. He hadn't been intimidated, hadn't shown any sign of weakness despite the physical confrontation. In fact, he had maintained an air of dignity that only made Kane feel smaller, more exposed. It was a sharp contrast to his own behavior. His pride had been wounded, yes, but it wasn't just his pride that was at stake. In his rashness, he had crossed a line that he couldn't undo, and that realization was beginning to gnaw at him. Kane's thoughts flickered to his colleagues. He had acted impulsively, but what would they think when they found out? What would they say about his conduct? He had been trusted to uphold the law, and in one reckless moment, he had shattered that trust. The weight of that responsibility suddenly feels heavier than ever before. He wonders whether they would see him as someone who had failed in his duty or as someone who had let his emotions override his sense of justice. In either case, the damage had been done. He had betrayed the very principles he swore to uphold. But the more Kane thinks about it, the more the regret sets in. He could still hear the pain in his own voice when he threatened the Rock, the anger that had welled up from a place within him that he didn't fully understand. It wasn't just anger at the Rock, though that was part of it, but it was also anger at himself, at the frustration that had built up from years of doing his job, day after day, without ever feeling like he truly made a difference. He had lashed out, using his badge as a weapon when, in reality, it was supposed to be a shield. And now, he found himself at a crossroads, staring down the consequences of his own actions. Officer Kane exhales deeply, trying to steady his breathing. His fingers slide over his phone, almost instinctively, but he hesitates before dialing the number. For a moment, the idea of facing the consequences seems overwhelming. The thought of admitting his mistake, of confronting the reality of his actions, feels like an insurmountable task. But Kane knows he can't avoid it. He can't continue to hide from the truth. He needs to make it right. The phone rings a few times before a familiar voice picks up. It's his partner, a voice he has trusted for years. Someone who had always been there through the ups and downs of their shared experiences in law enforcement. The moment the voice greets him, Kane knows this conversation is long overdue. Hey, it's Kane. I need to talk to you about something, he begins, his voice uncertain. There's no bravado, no false sense of authority in his tone. Just a man who knows he has made a mistake and is struggling to face the consequences of it. His partner is silent for a moment, and Kane can hear the slight shuffle of papers, the sound of a chair creaking as they adjust. He waits for a response, unsure of what his partner might say. Sure. What's going on? Comes the reply. The voice on the other end is calm, but there's a noticeable shift, a sense that something serious is about to be said. Kane hesitates for a moment, unsure of where to start, but he knows he has to be honest. There's no other way forward. "I messed up today," Kane admits, his voice strained with a mixture of frustration and remorse. I I attacked someone, and I shouldn't have. I let my emotions get the best of me, and I crossed a line that I can't take back." There's a long pause on the other end of the line. Kane can hear his partner's breathing slow, as if processing what he's just heard. "I didn't mean for it to go this far," Kane continues, his words tumbling out in a rush. "But now I realize the gravity of what I did. I lost control, and I don't know what to do now." The voice on the other end of the phone sighs, a deep, steadying breath. "Kane, you've got to take responsibility for this. You can't just brush it under the rug. But you're right about one thing. This wasn't you. Something's been building up, and I think you know it." Kane swallows hard, feeling a lump form in his throat. It's the first time in a long while that he's been this vulnerable, this honest about his flaws. "I don't know if I can fix this," he mutters, the weight of his own mistake bearing down on him. "You can," his partner responds firmly, "but it's going to take work, and it's going to take courage. But the first step is recognizing it. And that's exactly what you're doing right now." For the first time in what feels like forever, Officer Kane feels a sense of relief. There's no easy path to redemption, no simple solution. But in that moment, with his partner's words grounding him, he knows that facing his mistake is the only way forward. The shame, the guilt, they'll linger. But the journey toward righting the wrongs he's committed has begun. And it starts with owning up to what he did. The realization of his mistake isn't just a moment of self-reflection. It's the catalyst for change. It's the turning point where Officer Kane understands that growth comes not from denial, but from embracing his failures and using them as lessons to guide his future actions. The following days after the incident weigh heavily on Officer Kane's mind. The initial shock of his rash actions has begun to settle, but the embarrassment that follows lingers like an unshakable cloud. He walks through the police precinct with his head slightly lowered, avoiding the eyes of his colleagues. It's as if the walls are closing in, and every glance from fellow officers feels like a sharp reminder of the disgrace he has brought upon himself. The quiet whispers in the hallways only intensify his sense of humiliation. Though none of his peers have directly confronted him yet, Kane knows the rumors are swirling, the speculation thick in the air. The precinct, once a place of pride, now feels like a cage. He can't escape the memory of what he did, and he knows it won't be long before it spreads throughout the entire department. His failure to uphold the honor and responsibility that come with wearing the uniform feels like an unspoken weight on his shoulders, heavier than any equipment belt he's ever worn. Kane's embarrassment isn't just about the physical altercation with The Rock. It's about the loss of control. He had always prided himself on his ability to keep a cool head, to make sound decisions under pressure. He was known for being calm and collected, the officer others could count on in moments of crisis. But the moment he raised his fist, it shattered the very foundation of the image he had built. How could he face the department now? How could he face his peers, who had witnessed what happened? The sting of his actions isn't limited to the precinct. Outside the department, Kane has received nothing but stares and judgmental whispers. His name has made its way into the local news, the headlines full of speculation about his conduct. There is no escaping the consequences of his rash decision, and the public scrutiny feels even more suffocating than the judgment of his fellow officers. As the days pass, Kane's mood darkens. He spends most of his time in his office, eyes trained on the paperwork in front of him, but his mind isn't focused on the forms or reports. Instead, it drifts back to the scene of the confrontation with The Rock. He relives every moment, the tension in the air, the adrenaline that clouded his judgment, the punch that changed everything. Each time he recalls the event, the guilt tightens its grip on him. But in his isolation, he doesn't know where to turn. No one has come forward to offer him support or guidance, until that one morning when things begin to change. It's just another day at the precinct when Officer Thomas, a colleague Kane has worked alongside for several years, approaches him. Kane's eyes flicker up from his desk as Thomas leans against the doorframe of his office, an unreadable expression on his face. It's not the look of an angry officer, but rather one of concern. The kind of expression that signals a deeper understanding. Thomas has always been one of the more level-headed officers in the department, the type to step in when things get heated and calm the situation. In fact, he was often the one to smooth things over when tempers flared between officers. So when he steps into Kane's office that morning, there's a sense of hesitation in his actions. "Kane," Thomas says, his voice measured and gentle. "You all right?" Kane feels the weight of the question and hesitates for a moment. It's a simple inquiry, yet it feels loaded. He takes a breath, shifting uncomfortably in his seat. He wants to say something, anything, that will make him feel less ashamed. But the words seem to stick in his throat. Instead, he simply nods. "Yeah, I'm fine," Kane mutters, though the lie is as clear as day. Thomas doesn't push further. Instead, he walks into the room, pulling up a chair across from Kane's desk and sitting down. His body language is relaxed, but there's a clear sense of purpose in the way he sits. Kane avoids looking at him directly, not wanting to meet the gaze that feels far too knowing. After a long silence, Thomas breaks it. "Look, Kane, we all make mistakes. We're human." The words are simple, but they feel like a small lifeline in the midst of Kane's internal storm. He has heard others say it before, usually after a minor slip-up or mistake, but hearing it from Thomas, someone he respects, hits differently. Thomas continues, his tone never accusatory. "You're not the first officer to have a tough time handling a situation. You're not the first officer to mess up, either, and you won't be the last. But what's important now is how you handle it moving forward." Kane glances up, meeting Thomas's eyes for the first time. There's no anger there, no judgment, just a steady resolve that seems to reassure Kane, if only for a moment. "I've heard the talk," Thomas says, his voice softer now. "People are upset. Some of them think you crossed a line, and maybe you did, but they're also waiting for you to show them that you can own up to it. That's the first step, Kane. You've got to take responsibility." Kane exhales slowly, the weight of his own regret still heavy in his chest. "I know," he admits, his voice barely above a whisper, "but I don't know if I can fix this. I don't know how to make it right." Thomas leans forward slightly, his expression earnest. "You don't have to fix it all in one go, but you've got to start somewhere. You're not alone in this, Kane. We've all been there at some point, whether we want to admit it or not. The key is to learn from it. If you let this define you, it will. But if you stand up, admit your mistake, and show people you're taking steps to do better, that's when you'll earn back their trust." The weight of those words hangs in the air as Kane considers them. It's easy to see the truth in Thomas's advice, but it feels far more complicated than just following it. He's unsure if he even deserves the chance to make things right. But as he looks at Thomas, he begins to realize that this moment, this conversation, could be the first step toward redemption. Before Kane can respond, Officer Jenkins, another one of his colleagues, steps into the office. "Kane, you got a minute?" His tone is casual, but there's a noticeable seriousness in his voice. "Sure, Jenkins," Kane replies, his voice steady now, though the weight of the situation still hangs over him. Jenkins walks into the office, closing the door behind him. "I just wanted to say, man, we've all got your back. I know things are rough right now, but we're a team. We're here for you." Kane feels the sincerity in Jenkins's words, and it stirs something within him. He realizes that he's not as isolated as he thought. His colleagues, the ones who had been silently watching from the sidelines, weren't condemning him. They were offering their support, their understanding. It wasn't easy, but they were giving him the space to grow, to take responsibility without the looming threat of further judgment. "I appreciate that," Kane says quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "I really do." As the conversation continues, Kane starts to feel the weight on his shoulders lighten, if only slightly. His colleagues, Thomas, Jenkins, and others who have stepped in to offer their support, have given him the opportunity to start fresh, to work through his mistakes. It won't be an easy road, and Kane knows there will be more difficult conversations ahead. But for the first time in days, he feels a glimmer of hope. He can fix this. He just needs to take it one step at a time. The road to redemption will be long and fraught with challenges, but Kane knows that he's not facing it alone, and for that, he's grateful. As the dust settles in the aftermath of the incident, the truth becomes clearer. Officer Kane's rash decision to act in anger, which led to the confrontation with The Rock, was not just a personal failure but a reflection of the complexities and challenges faced by law enforcement officers every day. The incident, though explosive in its nature, also provided valuable lessons that resonated throughout the precinct and extended beyond the boundaries of Kane's professional life. In the end, it was not the mistake itself that defined Kane, but how he chose to handle the aftermath and learn from it. The fallout from the confrontation was a reminder of the high standards to which law enforcement officers are held. As public servants, officers are expected to maintain a sense of control, professionalism, and respect for others, especially in moments of crisis. The gravity of Kane's error was evident not just in his interactions with The Rock, but in the ripple effect it created within his team. His fellow officers, many of whom had worked alongside him for years, were left to pick up the pieces of a reputation that was, for a time, marred by his actions. It was clear that in the world of policing, any lapse in judgment could quickly become a matter of public record, often leaving an indelible mark on an officer's career and standing. But despite the initial embarrassment, Officer Kane's path to redemption was paved with his willingness to own up to his mistake. His colleagues, particularly Officer Thomas, who stepped forward to offer support, played a crucial role in helping Kane recognize the importance of taking responsibility. Thomas's words resonated deeply with Kane, reminding him that everyone makes mistakes, and it's not the mistake that defines a person, but how they choose to learn from it. Kane's moment of vulnerability became an opportunity for growth, not only for him, but for those around him as well. The support he received from his fellow officers was instrumental in helping Kane regain his sense of self. What could have been a permanent blemish on his career became, instead, a stepping stone toward becoming a better officer. His colleagues showed him that while accountability was essential, so too was compassion. They didn't just condemn his actions, they allowed him the space to reflect, to seek guidance, and ultimately, to make amends. This process of self-reflection and growth is often what distinguishes a true professional from someone who succumbs to the pressures of the job. For Officer Kane, the journey toward redemption required more than just an apology. It demanded a fundamental shift in how he viewed his role as an officer and as a person. The incident forced him to confront his own weaknesses and limitations, a process that is often painful but necessary for personal and professional development. Kane learned that true strength doesn't lie in the ability to assert power or dominate a situation, but rather in the capacity to remain composed, to listen, and to act with integrity, even when faced with challenges. The ability to remain grounded, to apologize when necessary, and to learn from one's mistakes is what defines a respected officer and leader. The lesson learned from this experience extends beyond the confines of the police precinct. It serves as a reminder to anyone in a position of authority or responsibility that the power to make decisions carries with it the responsibility to consider the consequences. Rash decisions, made in the heat of the moment, can have far-reaching impacts, not only on individuals, but also on entire communities. The Rock's response to Kane's actions was an important reminder of how public figures, especially those with a platform, have the power to influence how situations unfold. But more importantly, it underscored the idea that personal growth comes from owning one's mistakes and using them as an opportunity to improve. In the larger context, the story of Kane's confrontation with The Rock reveals the human side of law enforcement officers, how they too are susceptible to flaws, insecurities, and moments of weakness. Yet, it also highlights their capacity for growth and transformation when given the right support and tools. The story is a testament to the power of mentorship, peer support, and accountability in helping individuals navigate difficult situations. Officers like Kane are not just defined by their uniforms or their roles, they are defined by their ability to rise above adversity, learn from their mistakes, and contribute to the positive evolution of their community. As Kane moves forward in his career, the lesson he learned will stay with him. He now understands the value of patience, humility, and reflection in his daily interactions. whether with the public, his fellow officers, or those who look to him as a figure of authority. His ability to demonstrate self-awareness and resilience in the face of a public misstep has not only strengthened his personal integrity but also reinforced the bonds between him and his colleagues. His actions going forward will no longer be driven by pride or a desire to prove his worth, but by a commitment to doing better, to showing up for those around him, and to ensuring that his actions reflect the values of the department he serves. In conclusion, the confrontation between Officer Kane and The Rock, though regrettable, served as a catalyst for self-reflection and growth. Kane's journey from embarrassment to redemption highlights the importance of accountability, personal growth, and the power of support from colleagues. It is a reminder that everyone, regardless of their position or experience, is capable of making mistakes. But it is through those mistakes that we learn, evolve, and ultimately become better versions of ourselves. The story of Kane's redemption is a powerful reminder that it is not our failures that define us, but how we rise from them that truly matters.